Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Unexpected Guest. The morning sunlight streams through the tall windows of Whitehaven Manor, its golden rays illuminating the finely polished mahogany furniture and the delicate porcelain tea set arranged with impeccable precision. The house, an imposing Edwardian estate, sat in the rolling countryside of Sussex, surrounded by lush green lawns and an ancient yew hedge that shielded it from prying eyes. A place of refinement, of whispered scandals, and, at this moment, a house on the verge of tragedy. Inside the grand sitting-room, Lady Eleanor Witam sat stiffly in an overstuffed armchair, her face pale and drawn, her delicate fingers tightening around the embroidered handkerchief in her lap. Across from her stood a man, tall, lean, and impeccably dressed, his greying hair combed back, his dark eyes sharp beneath his fine spectacles. His name was Arthur Pembroke, solicitor to the Witam family, and his presence today was anything but routine. "You must listen to me, Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice measured and precise. "The situation is grave. I implore you, tell the truth." Lady Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. "The truth," she whispered. Pembroke nodded. "If you know something about Sir Hugo's disappearance, you must speak now." Before she could answer, the door burst open. A woman stood in the doorway, her dark curls dishevelled, her face flushed with agitation. "I must speak with Lady Eleanor," she declared breathlessly. The solicitor stiffened. "Miss Davenport, you cannot simply barge in." "I don't care," she cried. "It's about Sir Hugo, and—" She paused, swallowing hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I found something in the rose garden." Lady Eleanor's breath hitched. "What did you find?" Miss Davenport's fingers unclenched, revealing a small, delicate object. Resting in her palm, a gold wedding ring. The inside of the band was engraved, "To my dearest H, forever yours, E." Lady Eleanor let out a soft cry, for it was her ring, and she had not seen it in over 15 years. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot sat comfortably in his London apartment, his smooth frame perfectly poised, his moustaches groomed to absolute precision. A cup of dark chocolate rested on the table beside him, untouched, as he studied the letter in his hands. It was an invitation. Lady Eleanor Witam was requesting his assistance. "A most curious affair," Poirot murmured. Across from him, Captain Hastings leaned forward, curiosity glinting in his blue eyes. "A missing husband, an unexpected ring. Doesn't seem like much of a case, Poirot," he remarked. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, but you see only the surface." Hastings frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot held up the letter. "Consider, mon ami. A woman loses her husband. Years later, a ring, his ring, appears where it should not be. What does this tell us?" Hastings shrugged. "That someone found it after all these years." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Or that someone placed it there deliberately." Hastings stared. "You think it's a message?" Poirot nodded. "Mais oui. A message from someone who wants Lady Eleanor to remember." "Remember what?" Poirot leaned back in his chair. "Ah, Hastings, that is what we must discover." He set the letter down and took a delicate sip of his chocolate. "Pack your bags, mon ami. We leave for Sussex at once." The journey to Sussex was swift. the train cutting through the countryside like a silver thread, weaving its way through green tapestry. The air carried a crisp autumn chill, and the sky was an endless stretch of grey. As they arrived at Whitehaven Manor, Poirot observed the quiet tension that seemed to grip the house. The servants whispered in hushed voices, their gazes flitting toward the windows, as if fearing what might lurk beyond them. Lady Eleanor greeted them in the grand foyer. She was elegant, poised, but Poirot saw the weariness behind her eyes. "Mr. Poirot," she said softly, extending a gloved hand. "Thank you for coming." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, it is my honor." Hastings, ever the gentleman, added, "We shall do whatever we can to help." Lady Eleanor led them into a sunlit drawing-room, where Arthur Pembroke and Miss Davenport were already waiting. Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing: the stiffness in Pembroke's shoulders, the restless tapping of Miss Davenport's foot. Tension, secrets, lies waiting to be unravelled. Poirot settled into his chair. "Now, madam," he said, his voice calm, steady, "let us begin with the most important question." Lady Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Yes?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, when did you last see your husband?" Lady Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Then, in a whisper, she said, 15 years ago, on the night he vanished." Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest. "Bon, and tell me, madam." His voice was gentle but firm. "What really happened that night?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered. For the briefest moment, Poirot saw it. Fear. Something was very, very wrong, and Whitehaven Manor held more than one mystery. Chapter 2. The Night of the Vanishing. A hush settled over the drawing-room of Whitehaven Manor, the elegant silence punctuated only by the distant chime of a grandfather clock in the hall. Lady Eleanor Witam, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hesitated for a moment before answering Poirot's question. "The last time I saw my husband," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "was on the evening of September 18th, 15 years ago." Hercule Poirot tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Tell me, madam, what happened that night?" Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the silk of her dress. Across from her, Arthur Pembroke, the Witam family solicitor, sat perfectly still, his jaw set, as if bracing for an unpleasant memory. Miss Davenport, the housekeeper, looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. Poirot did not press her immediately. He had spent his life observing the delicate dance of deception, and he knew well when a person needed a gentle nudge rather than direct interrogation. Finally, Lady Eleanor exhaled softly, her gaze distant. "We were hosting a dinner party that evening," she began, "a gathering of close friends and associates of Hugo's. He was always a social man, you see. He relished these evenings." Poirot nodded. "Who was in attendance?" She hesitated. "There were 6 guests." Hastings pulled out his notebook and began to jot down names as Lady Eleanor listed them. Arthur Pembroke, the family solicitor; Sir Alfred Lytton, a retired colonel and long-time friend of Sir Hugo; Miss Charlotte Davenport, the housekeeper, and her brother Graham Davenport, the estate manager; Madame Isabelle Marchand, a French widow and old acquaintance of the Witcombes; Mr. Robert Gable, a business associate of Sir Hugo's. Poirot's moustache twitched. A well-rounded group. And tell me, madame, did the evening proceed as expected? Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together. At first, yes. The dinner was lovely. Hugo was in high spirits, as was the company. But, she paused, something changed after dinner. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Changed, madam? Lady Eleanor's gaze darkened. Yes, she said. There was an argument. Arthur Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Yes, I remember it well, he admitted. It was a rather heated exchange. Poirot gestured for him to continue. Pembroke removed his spectacles, polishing them with a silk handkerchief. It was between Hugo and Robert Gable. They had been discussing some business venture of Hugo's, and things grew rather tense. What sort of venture? Poirot inquired. Pembroke hesitated. A rather risky investment. Gable had warned Hugo against proceeding with it, but Hugo was a proud man. Hastings frowned. And what was this investment? Lady Eleanor shook her head. I was never privy to the details, but I know it was a large sum of money. Poirot studied her carefully. Did your husband seem afraid? Afraid? Lady Eleanor blinked. No, he was angry, furious even. Pembroke sighed. He accused Gable of trying to interfere in his affairs. Voices were raised. Gable stormed out of the room. Poirot's brows lifted. Did Sir Hugo follow him? Lady Eleanor hesitated. No, he stayed behind, seething. He poured himself a drink and sat by the fire. And then? Poirot pressed. Lady Eleanor's voice grew quieter, and then he was gone. Hastings paused in his writing. Gone? What do you mean, gone? Lady Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. One moment he was sitting there, and the next he had vanished. Poirot's eyes narrowed. At what time did you notice his absence? Miss Davenport finally spoke up. It was just past 11, sir. I had gone to fetch a tray from the sitting-room and saw that his chair was empty. Poirot nodded. And was the room disturbed in any way? No, Miss Davenport replied. Everything was exactly as we had left it, except Sir Hugo was gone. Poirot folded his hands. Was the door open? The window? Miss Davenport hesitated. The door was closed, but the window was slightly ajar. Hastings and Japp exchanged a glance. Poirot's expression did not change. And did anyone see him leave? Lady Eleanor shook her head. No one. Poirot tapped his fingers against the armrest. Curious, is it not? A man vanishes from his own home, leaving behind no sign of struggle, no farewell, no clear indication of departure. Hastings frowned. You think he left of his own accord? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Or perhaps, mon ami, he was made to leave. Poirot turned his attention to Miss Davenport. You were the one who found the ring, were you not? She nodded slowly. Yes, sir, in the rose garden. Describe its placement. Miss Davenport's brows furrowed. It was odd, now that I think of it. The ring wasn't buried nor hidden. It was resting on the gravel path, almost as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Poirot's moustache twitched. Indeed. And tell me, madam, this path, it is often walked? Miss Davenport shook her head. Not particularly. The garden is well kept, but few visit it in the colder months. Poirot nodded. Then I ask you, mes amis, Why would a wedding ring belonging to a man who vanished 15 years ago suddenly appear in a place where no one had reason to tread? A silence settled over the room. Then Hastings muttered, "Someone wants us to find it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Precisely." Lady Eleanor pressed her fingers against her temples. "But why now? Why after all these years?" Poirot's expression darkened. "Because, madame, someone has decided that the past is no longer content to remain buried." Pembroke sighed. "And what do you propose we do?" Poirot stood gracefully. "We must examine the past, monsieur, and I believe the best place to start is where it ended." Hastings blinked. "You mean—" Poirot turned toward Lady Eleanor. "If you would be so kind, madam," he said softly, "please show me the sitting-room where your husband was last seen." Lady Eleanor nodded slowly, and as she led them down the grand corridor toward the past, Poirot knew with certainty the game had finally begun. Chapter 3. The Sitting-Room Clue. The corridors of Whitehaven Manor were steeped in an eerie hush, the air heavy with the weight of long-buried secrets. As Lady Eleanor led Poirot, Hastings and Japp toward the sitting-room where Sir Hugo had last been seen, Poirot took in every detail. The ornate wall sconces, casting elongated shadows, the thick Persian rug that muffled their footsteps, and the faint scent of old books and faded cigar smoke lingering in the air. Lady Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second before pushing open the door to the sitting-room. The heavy wooden panels creaked softly, revealing an elegant chamber that seemed untouched by time. "This is where it happened," she murmured, stepping aside to let them enter. Poirot moved forward immediately, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The space was just as he had expected, richly furnished but strangely lifeless, as if frozen in the moment Sir Hugo had vanished. A grand fireplace stood at the far end of the room. Its marble mantel adorned with family portraits and fine porcelain figurines. To the right, a mahogany drinks cabinet gleamed under the dim light of the chandelier, a collection of aged brandy bottles standing in neat rows. The furniture was arranged immaculately, except for one empty chair near the hearth, Sir Hugo's chair. Poirot stepped toward it, pausing as he reached the thick red carpet that stretched beneath it. He lowered himself into a crouch, pressing his gloved fingers gently to the fibers. Then he smiled. "Ah," he murmured, "but this is most revealing." Hastings, who had been inspecting a nearby bookcase, turned. "What is?" Poirot rose gracefully. "Tell me, mes amis, what do you see here?" He gestured at the carpet. Japp frowned. "Looks normal to me." Hastings peered closer. "It does seem rather plush, doesn't it?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. It is of fine quality, is it not? Now tell me, if a man had been seated here for a long period, would we not expect to see some visible indentation in the pile of the rug?" Hastings blinked. "By Jove, you're right. There's no impression where his chair should have been." Japp scowled. "Meaning what, Poirot?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "Meaning, Chief Inspector, that Sir Hugo never truly sat here that night." Hush fell over the room. Lady Eleanor's brows knit together. "But I saw him sitting there." Poirot inclined his head. "Did you, madam? Or did you assume he had been sitting there because that is where he was expected to be?" A faint gasp escaped her lips. I I don't know, she admitted. It was such a long time ago. Miss Davenport stepped forward hesitantly. If he wasn't sitting there, where was he? Poirot's gaze flickered toward the drinks cabinet. Ah, he murmured. Perhaps he was here. With his usual delicacy, Poirot opened the cabinet doors, his fingers tracing the edges of the crystal decanters. He examined them one by one, before his hand paused mid-air. His keen eyes had caught something. A fine layer of dust coated the glassware, except for one particular tumbler, which was spotless. Poirot lifted the glass and turned to Hastings. Observe, mon ami, this glass is untouched by time, unlike the others. Why is that? Hastings scratched his head. Perhaps someone cleaned it recently. Poirot smiled. Ah, but that is precisely what makes it interesting. He turned to Lady Eleanor. Madame, forgive me, but has this room remained as it was since your husband's disappearance? She nodded. We had no reason to change it. I wished to keep it as it was. Ah, then, Poirot said, holding up the glass, who placed this back so recently? Silence fell once more. Japp's brows furrowed. You mean someone's been in here? Poirot nodded. Not just anyone, Chief Inspector. Someone who wanted to hide the fact that this glass had been used. Miss Davenport inhaled sharply. But if that glass was used recently, then that means— Poirot turned to her smoothly. It means that someone was here the night the ring was found. Hastings straightened. A connection between the ring and the sitting room. Precisely, Poirot murmured. Someone, perhaps the same person who placed the ring in the garden, came here, disturbed nothing, except for this one glass. Let out a low curse. Then we're dealing with someone who doesn't want us finding out the truth. Poirot smiled slightly. Or, Chief Inspector, someone who wants us to know just enough. Lady Eleanor exhaled shakily. But why? Poirot's expression darkened. That, madame, he said softly, is what we must uncover. As Hastings and Japp examined the rest of the sitting room, Poirot made his way to the large bay window. It was the only exit besides the main door, and Miss Davenport had already stated that on the night Sir Hugo disappeared, it had been left slightly ajar. Poirot studied the brass latches carefully, running his gloved fingers along the edges. He noted a faint scrape in the wood, a small but noticeable groove. Curious, he murmured. What is it, Poirot? Hastings asked. Poirot turned. This latch has been tampered with. It was forced open. Japp's head snapped up. Forced? You mean someone broke in? Poirot's moustache twitched. No, Chief Inspector, someone broke out. A collective silence filled the room. Lady Eleanor paled. You mean my husband didn't vanish? He escaped? Poirot shook his head. Not quite, madam. I do not yet know if he left willingly or was made to leave. But one thing is certain. He turned to Japp and Hastings. Sir Hugo did not simply disappear into thin air. He was taken through this very window. Hastings swallowed. So someone helped him. Or, Poirot said softly, someone ensured he never returned. Lady Eleanor clutched the edge of the fireplace, her face pale. I thought Hugo had vanished that night, she murmured. But if you're right, Poirot, then someone in this house, someone I trusted, was responsible. Poirot nodded solemnly. Yes, madame. And now, at last, they are beginning to make mistakes. Poirot turned to Japp. Chief Inspector, I believe it is time we speak to the guests who attended that dinner 15 years ago. Japp nodded firmly. Right, we'll bring them all in. Poirot smiled. Ah, no, mon ami, we shall go to them. Hastings frowned. You mean one by one? Poirot's eyes gleamed. A detective must observe his subjects in their natural habitat, Hastings. Only then will the truth reveal itself. Lady Eleanor exhaled shakily. And where will you start? Poirot turned to Japp. I shall start with the last man to argue with Sir Hugo Whitcomb. Japp's expression hardened. Robert Gable. Poirot smiled. Precisely. Chapter 4. The Man Who Argued. Last. The morning mist hung low over the rolling Sussex countryside as Poirot, Hastings and Japp set out from Whitehaven Manor to pay a visit to Robert Gable, the last man to have quarrelled with Sir Hugo Whitcomb. Their carriage rattled over the damp country roads, the autumn leaves drifting lazily from the branches of gnarled oaks. Hastings, ever the practical Englishman, adjusted his coat and turned to Poirot. I say, Poirot, do you really think Gable had something to do with it? Poirot's moustache twitched. I think, mon ami, that he knows more than he has admitted. Whether he was involved or merely a witness, that is what we must determine. Japp, seated across from them, grunted. Gable's a shrewd one, old business type, cutthroat when he needs to be. If he did something to Whitcomb, he won't make it easy for us. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but you see, Chief Inspector, that is the beauty of human nature. The more a man wishes to conceal, the more he betrays himself in his words, his gestures, his little mannerisms. Hastings crossed his arms. And what do you expect Gable will tell us? Poirot folded his hands. I expect he will try to tell us as little as possible. Gable's home was an impressive structure, though not nearly as grand as Whitehaven Manor. A stone-faced country house, sturdy, well-kept and unpretentious, it bore the unmistakable touch of a man who valued efficiency over elegance. The trio was greeted at the door by a thin, stiff-lipped butler, who led them into a modestly furnished study. The air smelled of polished oak and cigar smoke. Behind the desk sat Robert Gable, a man of about 60, with sharp grey eyes and a build that suggested he had once been broad-shouldered and formidable, though time had softened the edges. Gable gestured them toward the chairs across from him. I wasn't expecting company, he said, his voice deep, controlled. What can I do for you, gentlemen? Poirot settled into his chair, his small hands resting neatly on his lap. Monsieur Gable, we are here regarding Sir Hugo Whitcomb. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Gable's face. Sir Hugo? He echoed. What about him? Japp leaned forward. You were one of the last people to see him before he disappeared. We'd like to ask you about that night. Gable's jaw tightened ever so slightly. That was 15 years ago, Inspector. My memory isn't what it used to be. Poirot smiled pleasantly. Ah, but you see, monsieur, memory is a fascinating thing. The more one believes they have forgotten, the sharper the details become when asked the right questions. Gable exhaled through his nose. I don't know what you expect me to say. We argued, yes, but that was nothing unusual. Hugo was stubborn. He wouldn't listen. Hastings raised an eyebrow. And what was it about? Gable's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. A business deal. I advised him against it. He didn't like hearing he was making a mistake. Poirot tilted his head. Did he threaten you, monsieur? Gable's eyes darkened. Threaten me? No. But he made it clear that I should stay out of his affairs. Poirot watched him carefully. And after your quarrel, monsieur, what did you do? I left, Gable said simply. I didn't see Hugo again after that. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but Monsieur Gable, do you not find that curious? Gable stilled. What do you mean? Poirot's gaze was steady. That you left the party, and that shortly thereafter Sir Hugo vanished. Gable exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. You think I had something to do with it? He asked finally. Poirot lifted a hand. I think, monsieur, that you are a man of calculations, a man who does not take risks without cause. Gable gave a dry chuckle. And you believe Hugo was a risk to me? Poirot nodded once. Gable studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he let out a short laugh. You know, he said, shaking his head, I always suspected something was off about that night. Hastings sat up straighter. Go on. Gable's expression darkened. When I left Whitehaven Manor, I had every intention of returning the next day to speak with Hugo. But then I heard he had vanished, and not just disappeared, but without a trace. That didn't sit well with me. Japp leaned forward. And why didn't you come forward? Gable hesitated. Because I saw something. Poirot's eyes gleamed. What did you see, monsieur? Gable glanced between them before answering. I saw a light in the garden, just after I left. Hastings frowned. What kind of light? Gable shrugged. A lantern, I think. I was walking down the long drive when I glanced back. I could see the drawing-room windows were still lit, but further away, near the rose garden, I saw a second, smaller glow. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And did you see anyone? Gable shook his head. No, just the light, Japp muttered under his breath. That means someone was outside around the time Hugo disappeared. Hastings's brows furrowed. But why the garden? Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Because, mon ami, that is where the truth began. Gable hesitated. Look, I didn't mention it because I didn't think it mattered at the time. But if someone was out there that night, maybe they know more than we do. Poirot stood gracefully. Merci, monsieur. You have been most helpful. Gable exhaled. I hope you find out what really happened. For Eleanor's sake, if nothing else. Poirot's eyes sharpened. For Lady Eleanor. Gable nodded. Yes, she deserves the truth. Poirot smiled faintly. Oui, monsieur, he murmured. She does. As they left Gable's house, Hastings rubbed his chin. A light in the garden, a vanished man, and a missing ring. Poirot, I can't help but feel we're still missing something vital. Poirot nodded. Ah, but you see, Hastings, the pieces are coming together. Japp sighed. And what's the next move? Poirot turned toward Whitehaven Manor, now a distant silhouette against the grey sky. We must return to the garden, Chief Inspector, he said, because it is there that the final clue lies waiting. Hastings exhaled. Back to the beginning, eh? Poirot smiled. Always, mon ami, always. Chapter 5. The Secrets of the Rose Garden. The afternoon light had begun to wane by the time Poirot, Hastings, and Japp arrived back at Whitehaven Manor. The sky was streaked with hues of dusky pink and gold, casting long shadows over the vast estate grounds. The rose garden, nestled beyond a row of neatly trimmed hedges, stood eerily quiet, untouched by time, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. As they approached the entrance to the garden, Poirot paused. His sharp gaze drifted across the meticulously arranged flower beds, the winding gravel paths, and the grand stone fountain at the centre. A once beautiful fixture, now worn with age and covered in creeping ivy. Hastings, buttoning his coat against the evening chill, shivered slightly. "I must say, Poirot, there's something rather unsettling about this place." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Indeed, mon ami, it is unsettling because this garden holds a secret, and secrets, as you know, do not enjoy remaining hidden forever." Japp huffed. "Right then, where do we start?" Poirot gestured toward the gravel path, where Miss Davenport had discovered the wedding ring. The tiny golden band had already caused a stir within Whitehaven Manor, but Poirot suspected that its placement had been deliberate. A message left for someone, or more likely, for him. He crouched, running a gloved finger across the scattered pebbles, his eyes narrowing in keen observation. The ring had been found resting atop the gravel, meaning it had not been dropped accidentally, but placed there with intention. Poirot straightened and turned to Japp. "Chief Inspector, your men searched this area when the ring was first found, did you not?" Japp nodded. "Aye, they did, but nothing turned up." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but you see, my dear Japp, when one looks with the expectation of finding something obvious, one often misses what is truly important." Hastings sighed. "And what are we looking for exactly?" Poirot smiled faintly. "That, mon ami, is what we shall soon discover." Poirot began his examination with his usual meticulous care, walking the garden in a deliberate pattern, his sharp eyes flitting over every detail. It was only a few moments later that he stopped abruptly near the base of the fountain, his keen gaze fixed on a small section of the soil just beyond the fountain's stone rim. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "There." Hastings and Japp stepped closer. "What is it?" Japp asked. Poirot pointed. "Do you see, mes amis? The earth here is different from the rest." Hastings frowned. "It does look slightly darker." Poirot nodded. "Oui, and softer too, as though it has been disturbed recently." Japp's expression hardened. "You think someone dug something up here?" Poirot pressed his foot lightly into the soil, testing its give. "Perhaps, Chief Inspector, it is quite the opposite." Japp stared at him. "You mean something was buried here?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Ah, Chief Inspector, it is only ever a question of what and why." Without hesitation, Japp signalled for one of the Whitehaven staff, who soon arrived with a small spade. As the inspector began to dig, the earth came away easily, damp and loose, as though it had only recently been turned over. A few inches deep, the blade of the spade struck something solid. Japp exhaled sharply. "There's something here." Carefully, he knelt down, brushing away the loose dirt. Within moments, a small wooden box was revealed, its surface weathered, its edges sealed with rusted hinges. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Voila," he murmured. "The garden has given up its secret." Japp lifted the wooden box carefully, setting it atop the stone rim of the fountain. The three men leaned in as Japp used a pocket-knife to pry open the rusted latch. The lid creaked as it swung open, revealing the contents within. Inside, wrapped in aged cloth, were a handful of yellowed papers, and, most curiously, a silver pocket-watch. Poirot reached for the papers first, unfolding them carefully. The ink had faded with time, but the writing remained legible. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "What do they say?" Poirot's brows lifted slightly. "They appear to be letters," Japp scowled. "Letters? What kind of letters?" Poirot read aloud, his voice calm and measured. "My dearest E, I fear that things have gone too far. If they find out what I have done, I do not know what will happen. I must leave before it is too late. If you love me, meet me in the garden at midnight. I will wait for you. But if I do not see you, I will understand. Know that I will always be yours, forever." The letter was signed only with the initial H. Hastings' breath caught. "My word, that must be Sir Hugo's letter." Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed, mon ami." Japp rubbed his chin. So he was planning to leave. Why? And who was he writing to? Poirot turned his gaze toward Lady Eleanor's window. "Ah, but is it not obvious, Chief Inspector? He was writing to his wife." Japp sighed heavily. "So what now?" "This letter confirms he was planning to run, but it still doesn't tell us why." Poirot reached for the silver pocket-watch, his fingers carefully flipping it open. Inside, the hands had stopped at precisely 12:05. Hastings stared, and midnight, and 5 minutes. Poirot's eyes darkened. "Yes, Hastings," he murmured. "It would seem that Sir Hugo never made it beyond the garden that night." Japp exhaled sharply. "You think he was killed?" Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "I think," he said quietly, "that someone wanted us to believe he vanished. But in truth, he was here all along." A chill settled over the garden. Hastings swallowed. "Then, where is he now?" Poirot's gaze drifted back to the freshly dug soil, then to the fountain. And then he whispered the words that sent an unmistakable shiver down their spines. "Perhaps, mon ami, he never left at all." Chapter 6. The Secret Beneath the Air Fountain. Deep silence hung over the rose garden. Poirot's words, soft yet chilling, settled like a shadow upon Hastings and Japp. The detective stood still, his sharp gaze fixed on the stone fountain, its ivy-covered structure looming like a silent witness to a forgotten crime. Hastings, though often dismissive of Poirot's flair for the dramatic, found his throat suddenly dry. "You think Hugo was buried here?" he murmured. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It is not merely what I think, mon ami. It is what the evidence suggests." Japp grunted. "It's a hell of a thing to accuse someone of, Poirot." Poirot turned his gaze to the inspector. Would you rather I remain silent and allow a mystery to go unsolved, Chief Inspector?" Japp sighed, rubbing his forehead. "No, but if he was buried here, then we'll need to dig. And if you're wrong, Poirot." Poirot held up a hand. "Ah, but when am I ever wrong, Chief Inspector?" Japp muttered something under his breath before gesturing for a gardener, who had been watching their activities from a discreet distance, to fetch tools. Within moments 2 men returned, carrying shovels and a pry-bar. As the digging began, Poirot stepped back slightly, his sharp eyes taking in every reaction. Lady Eleanor had appeared at the edge of the garden, her face pale as parchment. Miss Davenport stood behind her, one hand gripping the folds of her skirt. Arthur Pembroke, the family solicitor, had joined them, his usual composure strained. For several minutes the shovels cut through damp earth, the sound of metal against soil filling the garden. Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his breath visible in the cooling evening air. Then suddenly, a dull thud. Japp froze. He exchanged a glance with Hastings before kneeling down. His fingers brushed away loose dirt until something solid and unyielding was revealed beneath the layers of earth. "A wooden beam." Japp muttered a curse under his breath. "There's something here, all right." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Chief Inspector, I believe we have found the resting place of our missing man." With great effort, the gardener and Japp pried at the wooden structure, clearing away more soil until the outline of a trapdoor emerged. The wood was aged and rotting, the iron hinges rusted from years of exposure to dampness. Hastings exhaled sharply. "A hidden door, under the fountain." Poirot nodded. "Oui, mon ami, and I suspect it leads to something quite old." Japp signalled to one of the gardeners, who fetched a crowbar. With a deep breath, the inspector wedged it beneath the wooden hatch, and after a few strained efforts, the door gave way with a groan, revealing a dark passage leading underground. The air that escaped from below was cold and damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of earth and decay. Lady Eleanor let out a soft gasp. "I never knew this existed." Poirot turned to her, his expression gentle yet firm. "No, madam, but someone did." Hastings peered into the darkness, shivering slightly. "You're not seriously suggesting we go down there, are you, Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Hastings, mon ami, do you not wish to uncover the truth?" Hastings gulped. "Not when it involves descending into an ancient crypt in the middle of a murder investigation." Japp grumbled. "Too late for that. Someone hand me a lantern." A servant rushed forward, producing a small oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long shadows over the stone walls as Japp and Poirot descended into the darkness. Hastings sighed and followed. "If I don't make it out of here, Poirot, I'm haunting you." Poirot chuckled softly. "Then at least I shall never be without good company." The passage was narrow and damp, its stone walls slick with condensation. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, as though the very walls held their breath. At the bottom of the staircase, the tunnel opened into a small underground chamber, its ceiling low and arched, its floor littered with loose stones and debris. A stone pedestal stood at the center, upon which rested what appeared to be an old wooden chest, its surface warped and crumbling. Japp approached cautiously, holding the lantern high. "This place must be centuries old." Poirot ran his fingers over the aged stone. "A family crypt, perhaps, forgotten over time." Hastings frowned. But what would Sir Hugo have been doing down here? Poirot's eyes darkened. That is the question, is it not? Then, with a sudden creaking sound, Japp pried open the wooden chest. And there, among the tattered remains of old documents and artifacts, a skeleton lay curled within. The air grew deathly silent. Poirot exhaled softly. "Ah," he murmured, "at last we have found him." Hastings swallowed hard. "You mean that's Sir Hugo?" Japp grimaced. "We'll need a proper examination, but given the location, I'd say it's likely." Poirot crouched, his keen eyes scanning the skeletal remains. His fingers traced the torn remnants of a jacket, brushing against something metallic embedded in the rib cage. He carefully extracted it. A knife, rusted with age. Japp's brows furrowed. "Well, that answers that." Hastings shifted uneasily. "You mean he didn't just disappear?" Poirot straightened, his expression grim. "Non, mon ami. He was murdered." Lady Eleanor's sharp intake of breath echoed from above. Poirot turned back to the skeleton, his mind racing through possibilities. Sir Hugo had not run away that night. He had been lured to this crypt, betrayed, murdered, and left to rot beneath the very garden he once walked upon. But by whom and why? Poirot knew the answers were close. The ring in the garden, the letters, the missing glass in the sitting room. Someone had tried to hide the truth for 15 years. And now, at last, the time for secrets was over. Poirot turned to Japp, Chief Inspector. "We must gather everyone at Whitehaven Manor," he said quietly, "for I believe, at last, it is time for the final act." Chapter 7. The Gathering of Suspects. The atmosphere inside Whitehaven Manor was thick with tension. Poirot, Hastings, and Japp had returned from their discovery beneath the fountain, their clothes dusted with dirt, their expressions grim with revelation. The news of the skeletal remains and the rusted knife had spread quickly. And now, as the great hall filled with the last guests of the infamous dinner party 15 years ago, Poirot observed each face with silent precision. Seated before him were the principal players in this long-buried tragedy. Lady Eleanor Witam, her usual composure frayed, her hands clenched in her lap. Arthur Pembroke, the solicitor, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against his chair's arm. Miss Charlotte Davenport, the housekeeper, pale but eerily calm. Sir Alfred Lytton, the retired colonel, stiff-backed and unsmiling. Madame Isabelle Marchand, the French widow, her sharp eyes unreadable. Robert Gable, the business associate, who sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Japp stood near the door, his usual bluntness subdued by the weight of the moment. Hastings shifted uncomfortably beside Poirot, his brow furrowed with the lingering unease of their recent discovery. Poirot, however, remained serene. With a calculated pause, he let his gaze drift across the assembled figures before he spoke. "Mesdames and messieurs," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, "we stand upon the precipice of truth. For 15 years, a question has lingered. What truly happened to Sir Hugo Whitcomb?" A murmur rippled through the group. Lady Eleanor stiffened. Poirot continued. "Until now, many believed he had disappeared, that he had abandoned his home, his fortune, and his wife." He paused. "But we now know That was not the case. A heavy silence settled over the room. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Sir Hugo never left Whitehaven Manor that night. He did not run. He did not vanish into the mist. He took a step forward. He was murdered. A gasp escaped from Lady Eleanor's lips. Sir Alfred's face turned ashen. Arthur Pembroke let out a sharp breath, while Miss Davenport's fingers tightened in her lap. Poirot folded his hands. His remains were found beneath the fountain in the rose garden, concealed in a forgotten crypt. Another murmur swept the room, followed by stunned silence. Japp crossed his arms. "And someone here knows exactly how he got there." Poirot moved toward the grand fireplace, standing where Sir Hugo himself had once sat on the night of his demise. He traced the mantelpiece with a delicate touch, his expression unreadable. "Let us revisit the night in question," he said, turning back toward the room. "After dinner, Sir Hugo was seen here in this very chair. There was a heated argument between him and Monsieur Gable." Robert Gable nodded curtly. "We exchanged words, yes, but I left. I never saw him after that." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, monsieur, but the question is not merely who last saw Sir Hugo. The question is, who knew where he was going next?" He let his words hang in the air before continuing. "We have evidence that Sir Hugo intended to leave that night. A letter found buried in the garden, written in his own hand, confirms that he was frightened, that he needed to escape." Lady Eleanor clutched her hands together. "Escape? From what?" Poirot turned his sharp gaze upon her. "From the very people he once trusted." A faint tremor passed through her features. Poirot continued. "We know he was meant to meet someone in the garden at midnight. And we now know—" He paused, looking at each guest carefully. "That he never made it out alive." Poirot gestured toward Miss Davenport, who had remained oddly silent throughout the proceedings. "Miss Davenport," he said smoothly, "you were among the last to move through the house that evening, were you not?" Miss Davenport hesitated. I was simply ensuring everything was in order." Poirot smiled gently. "But of course, a housekeeper's duty, no?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, I checked the drawing-room. Then I retired." Poirot's expression did not change. "And yet, someone placed a glass back into the cabinet recently. A glass Sir Hugo had used." A flicker of panic crossed her face. "Surely, madam," Poirot said softly, "you do not mean to tell me that the ghost of Sir Hugo Whitcomb cleaned up after himself?" A cold, deafening silence. Miss Davenport's face paled. Japp stepped forward. "You knew, didn't you?" he growled. "You knew what happened that night?" Miss Davenport's breathing became shallow. I... Poirot lifted a hand. "Ah, patience, Chief Inspector." He turned back to Miss Davenport. "Madame, I do not think you had any part in Sir Hugo's death, but I do believe you saw something." Her lips pressed together. I didn't think it mattered after all these years." Poirot arched a brow. "No, madame, that is not quite true. You knew it mattered, because someone made sure you did not speak of it." A faint tremor ran through her. Poirot lowered his voice. "What did you see, Miss Davenport?" Her gaze flickered toward Lady Eleanor. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured, "I saw her." Lady Eleanor's head snapped up. "Me?" Miss Davenport clutched the edge of her chair. "I saw you, madam. I saw you leave the house that night. After Sir Hugo, the room erupted into chaos. Lady Eleanor shook her head rapidly. No, that's absurd. I never. Poirot raised a hand. Lady Eleanor, denials will do you no good. We know Sir Hugo went into the garden that night, and we now have a witness who saw you follow. She swallowed hard. Hastings, who had been watching her closely, exhaled. You were there, weren't you? Lady Eleanor's hands trembled. I didn't kill him, she burst out. I only wanted to stop him. Poirot's gaze darkened. But someone else did. The room fell silent. Poirot took a step forward. Lady Eleanor, tell us, who else was in the garden that night? She hesitated. Poirot's voice was like steel. You are protecting someone, madam, but ask yourself, has this person protected you? A moment passed, then in a broken whisper she spoke one name. Arthur. All eyes turned to Arthur Pembroke, the family solicitor, who sat deathly still. Japp's jaw tightened. You, Poirot's smile vanished. Yes, Chief Inspector. Monsieur Pembroke has been guiding this family's affairs for years, and I suspect he did not want Sir Hugo to expose something he had done. Arthur Pembroke exhaled shakily. I had no choice. Poirot stepped forward. Sir Hugo found out, did he not, that you had been stealing from him for years? Pembroke's face turned ghostly white. Japp reached for his face, turned ghostly white. Japp reached for his cuffs. I think that's quite enough, Mr. Pembroke. As the inspector moved in, Pembroke sagged in his chair, defeated. Poirot straightened his cuffs. At last, he murmured, the truth uncovered. Chapter 8. The Final Deductions. A heavy silence fell over the grand hall of Whitehaven Manor. Poirot's revelation had shattered the carefully maintained facade of Arthur Pembroke's innocence, leaving the solicitor ashen-faced and rigid in his chair. The room, once grand and full of quiet prestige, now felt suffocating. A place where secrets had festered for 15 years. Japp stepped forward, his expression hard. Arthur Pembroke, you'd best start talking. You've got a lot to answer for. Pembroke's fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. His normally composed demeanor was crumbling. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered, his voice hoarse. I never wanted to kill him. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, spoke softly. Arthur, why? Pembroke's gaze flickered toward her. You must understand. I had no choice. Poirot, ever the master of calm patience, folded his hands neatly. Ah, monsieur, there is always a choice. A muscle in Pembroke's jaw twitched. No, not in my case. If Hugo had exposed me, I would have lost everything. Poirot paced slowly, his voice steady as he unravelled the truth. Let us reconstruct the events of that night, he said. Sir Hugo had discovered something damning. He had realized that someone within his own household had been betraying him. Poirot gestured toward Pembroke. Monsieur, you had been handling his legal affairs for years, no? And it was you who had access to his financial records. Pembroke exhaled sharply. Yes. Poirot nodded. Sir Hugo, a man of great pride and little forgiveness, must have realized that funds were being siphoned from his estate. And who better to suspect than the man who controlled his money? Hastings leaned forward. So he confronted you. Pembroke nodded slowly. He did. That night. He had the evidence. He told me he was going to turn me in. Poirot sighed softly. And so you followed him to the garden. A shudder ran through Pembroke's body. I only meant to talk to him. I wanted to make him reconsider. Lady Eleanor stared at him. And yet you killed him. Pembroke's face twisted in anguish. It wasn't meant to happen like that, he said suddenly. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He told me he was leaving, that he was going to ruin me. I panicked. His voice broke. We were near the fountain. I grabbed him, just to stop him from leaving. But he struggled. He tried to push me away. And then his breath hitched. I had a knife in my coat. I don't even remember taking it out. But suddenly he was falling backward, clutching his chest. He looked at me, his eyes wide. And then he was gone. A ripple of horror spread through the room. Poirot, however, remained unmoved. And then what, monsieur? Pembroke let out a shuddering sigh. I didn't know what to do. I was standing there, my hands covered in his blood. I thought about running, about confessing, but then I realized no one had seen us. Miss Davenport let out a quiet gasp. So, Pembroke continued, I did the only thing I could think of. I dragged his body down into the crypt. I knew about it. I had seen the records of the old estate plans. It had been forgotten, but it was still there. His eyes darkened. I buried him beneath the fountain that night. Japp let out a low curse. And the missing wedding ring. Pembroke let out a bitter chuckle. That was a mistake. In my panic, I didn't notice that Hugo's ring had slipped from his finger when I moved him. I only realized it later, when it was too late. Poirot's moustache twitched. Ah, that is why, when Miss Davenport found it recently, you began to panic. Pembroke's jaw tightened. Yes. When I heard that a ring had turned up, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone started digging, literally. Hastings shook his head in disbelief. And all this time you let Lady Eleanor suffer. You let her wonder what had happened to her husband while you carried on with your life. A flash of guilt crossed Pembroke's face. I told myself I was protecting her. Poirot tilted his head. No, monsieur. You were only protecting yourself. Lady Eleanor stood, her posture rigid with restrained fury. You were our friend, Arthur, she whispered. Hugo trusted you. I trusted you. Pembroke averted his gaze. I had no choice. Poirot stepped forward. You had many choices, Monsieur Pembroke, but you took the one that led to 15 years of deception. Japp shook his head. Well, it's over now. He stepped toward Pembroke, producing a pair of handcuffs. Arthur Pembroke, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Hugo Witam. Pembroke, his strength finally spent, simply nodded. I suppose, he murmured. I always knew it would end like this. Poirot's expression softened just slightly. Yes, monsieur, he said quietly. It always does. The following morning, Poirot and Hastings prepared to depart from Whitehaven Manor. The mist had lifted, and the countryside lay bathed in the golden light of early autumn. As they stood by the waiting car, Lady Eleanor approached them. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. I wanted to thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot inclined his head. "You are most welcome, madam." She exhaled slowly. "I loved Hugo, despite everything, but I always knew in my heart that he had not abandoned me. Now, at least, I know the truth." Poirot studied her. "And the truth, madame, no matter how painful, is always better than doubt." She gave a small, sad smile. "Yes, yes, I believe you are right." Poirot nodded. "Now, madame, life continues, and you must decide how you wish to live yours." She looked away, toward the sprawling gardens, where a great mystery had finally been put to rest. "I suppose I shall try," she whispered. "Finally been put to rest." "I suppose I shall try," she whispered. Poirot smiled gently. "Bon." As Hastings and Poirot climbed into the car, Hastings let out a breath of relief. "Well, Poirot, another case solved. A tragic one, but solved nonetheless." Poirot tilted his head. "Indeed, Hastings. But do not let tragedy overshadow the lesson." Hastings arched a brow. "And what lesson is that?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "That even the grandest estates cannot bury the past forever." The car rattled down the countryside road, leaving Whitehaven Manor behind. The case of Sir Hugo Witam was finally closed. Chapter 9. Reflections on Justice. The countryside stretched endlessly before them as the car wound its way back toward London. Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed on the passing hedgerows, as if reading some unseen puzzle in the landscape. Beside him, Hastings shifted, his expression pensive. "I say, Poirot," Hastings finally ventured, "this one was rather tragic, wasn't it?" Poirot turned slightly, his sharp eyes meeting Hastings. "Ah, mon ami, are not all crimes tragic?" "Well, yes, I suppose," Hastings admitted, "but something about this case feels different. There was no grand conspiracy, no criminal mastermind, just a man, a desperate, frightened man who made a terrible decision." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui, Hastings, but do not mistake simplicity for lack of wickedness. It is often in the ordinary, in the acts of desperate men, that we find the greatest crimes." Hastings sighed. "I suppose Arthur Pembroke wasn't an evil man, just a weak one." Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, but mon ami, is that not often the same thing?" Hastings frowned. "That's a bit harsh, isn't it? He didn't set out to kill Sir Hugo." Poirot's voice was gentle yet firm. "No, but he still did. And weakness, Hastings, can be just as dangerous as malice. Pembroke did not mean to kill, but when faced with exposure, with ruin, with disgrace, he acted. And then, instead of confessing, he spent 15 years burying his crime, just as he buried Sir Hugo." Hastings shuddered. "That poor woman, Lady Eleanor. Imagine living all those years not knowing what happened to her husband." Poirot nodded. "It is a cruelty, no? But it is always the living who suffer most in the wake of a crime." Hastings sighed. "And what of Miss Davenport? I suppose she must feel awful for keeping silent." Poirot's expression softened. "She was afraid, Hastings. She was young, a servant in a grand house. She saw something she did not fully understand, and later, when the rumors of Sir Hugo's disappearance began, she convinced herself it was best not to speak." Hastings leaned back. "It seems everyone in Whitehaven Manor was carrying a secret." Poirot smiled faintly. That, mon ami, is the nature of human beings. The car bumped along the road, and for a time the two men sat in quiet reflection. Finally, Hastings spoke again. "Do you ever wonder, Poirot, whether justice is always served?" Poirot's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Elaborate, Hastings." "Well," Hastings hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Arthur Pembroke will stand the trial, of course. He'll be punished for what he did. But in the end, Sir Hugo is still dead. Lady Eleanor still spent 15 years in limbo. No one truly wins, do they?" Poirot exhaled softly. "Ah, Hastings, you seek comfort in the notion that justice is always clean. But crime, mon ami, is rarely so accommodating." Hastings crossed his arms. "So what? We just accept that life is unfair." Poirot tilted his head. "No, Hastings. We accept that justice is not always about winning or losing. It is about the truth being revealed, about ensuring that those who commit crimes are not allowed to escape their consequences." Hastings sighed. "I suppose so." Poirot gave him a smile. "Besides, mon ami, if one desires fairness, one should not look for it in crime. Crime is selfish, it is cruel, and it always leaves its mark." Hastings glanced out the window. "You know, you might be the most philosophical detective in all of England." Poirot chuckled. "Ah, but philosophy, Hastings, is merely another method of deduction." Hastings rolled his eyes, but said nothing further. The trees lining the road blurred past as they continued their journey back to London. But the case of Sir Hugo Whitcomb's disappearance lingered in the air, its mystery solved, but its wounds still fresh. As the car approached the outskirts of the city, Hastings suddenly sat up. "There's something that still puzzles me, Poirot." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, and what is that, mon ami?" Hastings rubbed his chin. "Pembroke buried Sir Hugo, right? But why the crypt? Why not just get rid of the body another way?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "An excellent question, Hastings." Hastings frowned. "I mean, the crypt was old, forgotten. It was a clever place to hide a body, yes, but wouldn't it have been easier to—" He hesitated. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "To what, Hastings?" Hastings met his gaze. "To dispose of the body entirely. The lake, the moors, the estate is vast. And yet Pembroke chose to bury him under Whitehaven Manor itself. Why?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "Hastings," he murmured, "I do believe you have stumbled upon something most interesting." Japp had said it was over. Arthur Pembroke had confessed, and yet something still did not add up. Poirot smiled faintly. "The game, mon ami, is not quite over yet," Hastings groaned. "I knew you were going to say that." Poirot simply chuckled. As the car rattled through the streets of London, the case of Sir Hugo Whitcomb's murder was, it seemed, not entirely closed after all. Chapter 10. Poirot's Final Thoughts. London lay beneath a veil of early evening mist as the car carrying Poirot and Hastings pulled up outside Whitehaven House, the town residence of Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. The gas lamps flickered along the quiet street, their golden glow casting elongated shadows against the stone facade of the grand estate. As the car came to a halt, Hastings turned to Poirot. His brows furrowed in mild exasperation. "I say, Poirot, I thought this case was closed." Poirot smiled faintly, adjusting the cuffs of his impeccable jacket. "Ah, mon ami, the case is solved, yes, but it is not yet closed." Hastings sighed. "There's a difference." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "But of course, to solve a case is to find the culprit. To close a case, one must ensure that every question has been answered." Hastings crossed his arms. "And you think something is still missing?" Poirot nodded. "I know something is still missing." With that, he stepped out of the car, his movements brisk and purposeful. Hastings sighed once more, but followed, knowing there was no point in arguing when Poirot had that particular gleam in his eye. Lady Eleanor received them in the drawing-room, her expression unreadable. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting flickering shadows across the ornate furnishings. "I wasn't expecting to see you again, Monsieur Poirot," she said smoothly, her hands folded in her lap. Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, I would not trouble you again unless it was of utmost importance." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit. If this is about Arthur Pembroke, I've already spoken to the police." Poirot shook his head gently. "Ah, no, madam. I do not come to speak of Arthur Pembroke. I come to speak of you." A flicker of unease passed across her features. "Me?" Poirot nodded. "Oui. You see, madam, there is something that has been bothering me ever since we discovered Sir Hugo's remains. Something illogical." She stiffened slightly. "And what would that be?" Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "Why was Sir Hugo buried in the crypt beneath the fountain?" A beat of silence. Lady Eleanor's fingers curled slightly into the folds of her dress. "Arthur must have thought it the best place to hide the body." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but you see, madame, Arthur Pembroke had every reason to want Sir Hugo's body to be gone, not hidden. He had 1,000 opportunities to dispose of the corpse in a manner that would ensure it was never found. But instead, he chose to place it within a crypt that, while forgotten, was still part of the estate." "Why?" Lady Eleanor said nothing. Hastings shifted uneasily. "You're saying there's more to this than just covering up a murder?" Poirot's voice was soft, almost coaxing. "Madame, there is something you have not told us." Lady Eleanor exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering to the fire. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew." Hastings' eyes widened. "You knew? You mean you knew Arthur killed your husband?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Poirot's expression did not change, but his gaze sharpened. "From the very beginning." A pause. Then, "Yes." Hastings let out a low whistle. "My word." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And yet you said nothing." "For 15 years." Eleanor's expression was strangely serene. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot, my husband was a cruel man. He was manipulative, deceitful. There were things I knew about him, terrible things. I had once considered leaving, but he made it very clear that if I did, he would ruin me." Her hands trembled slightly. "And then, that night, he told me he was leaving, that he was done with me. And for the first time I felt relief." Hastings shook his head. "You're saying you were glad he was gone?" A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. "I did not mourn him, if that is what you are asking." Poirot observed her carefully. "And so, when Arthur Pembroke came to you, when he told you what he had done, You chose to protect him." She nodded. "He was desperate, and I saw an opportunity. With Hugo gone, I was free. But if I reported Arthur, the scandal would have ruined everything. The estate, my reputation, my standing in society. So I told him to bury Hugo in the crypt. I even helped him. And then I told him never to speak of it again." Hastings stared at her in disbelief. "You helped him bury the body?" Her expression was utterly calm. "Yes." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "And the ring, madame? That detail, you did not account for it." Lady Eleanor gave a small, mirthless laugh. "No, that was my mistake. I told Arthur to take care of everything, but neither of us noticed that the ring had fallen. And once it was found, I knew it was only a matter of time." She lifted her chin slightly, her regal composure returning. "But it does not matter now. The truth is out, and I am still free." Poirot observed her for a long moment. Then he stood, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate suit. "Indeed, madam, the truth is out." Lady Eleanor tilted her head. "And what will you do with it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot gave her a slight smile. "Ah, madam, I am but a humble detective. My work is only to uncover the truth." Hastings gaped. "Poirot, you can't mean to let her—" Poirot held up a hand. "Hastings, mon ami, justice has already been served." He turned to Lady Eleanor one final time. "You, madame, must now live with what you have done." With that, Poirot tipped his hat. "Bonne soirée, Lady Eleanor." And with Hastings, still spluttering in disbelief, they left. As the train pulled away from the countryside, Hastings turned to Poirot, his expression troubled. "Poirot, I don't understand. You knew she was part of it. Why didn't you turn her in?" Poirot gazed out the window. "Hastings, tell me, who suffered the most from Sir Hugo's death?" Hastings frowned. "Well, I suppose Lady Eleanor did, in a way. She lived with the secret all these years." Poirot nodded. "And now she will live with it forever." Hastings sighed. "You do have a strange way of looking at justice." Poirot smiled faintly. "Justice, mon ami, is not always delivered by the courts. Sometimes justice is simply the weight of one's own conscience." Hastings sighed again. "I'll never understand you." Poirot chuckled. "Ah, Hastings, that is why we make such an excellent pair." The train continued on toward London, leaving behind Whitehaven Manor and its long-buried secrets. The case of Sir Hugo Witam was finally closed.